Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. We have a lot of verses to go through tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, again, as we gather together to open your word and partake of what you have for us, I pray that you will anoint this time together. Anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have to be said. And then anoint our hearts to open up and receive those things you have for us. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, tonight there's a lot of verses. There's 57 verses, I think, in this chapter. So we got a lot of pages, and I've got some pictures on the back, and I'll explain those as we kind of go through this. All right, so let's start Judges chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. Then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem, to his mother's brothers, and spoke with them with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, Please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. Which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you? Remember that I am your own flesh and bone. And his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. And their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our brother. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah, and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, because he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. Okay, so, yeah. So you remember Abimelech was the son of Gideon by his concubine, or his maid, if you will. That was another word for him. And she lived in Shechem. And so Abimelech was the son of Gideon. So he was from the tribe of Manasseh, but he was also of the city of Shechem, which were not Israelites. So he was this bastard child, if you will, that was born. And we're gonna look through what happens when you allow these kinds of things to happen. Shechem was a city in Samaria. It stood in a narrow sheltered valley between Ebal on the north and Gerizim on the south. These mountains at their base being only 500 some yards apart. So if you look at your pictures, there's a picture of the two mountains. That top picture there. That's the two mountains, and that in the middle was called Shechem, that town that's in the middle. So you can kind of get a layout of the land. You can see how this was put together. Now, Shechem was an interesting place. Here, Abraham pitched his tent and built his first altar in the promised land and received the first divine promise, Genesis 12:6-7. Here also, Jacob bought a parcel of land at the hands of the children of Hamor, and after his return from Mesopotamia, he settled with his household, which he purged from idolatry by burying the teraphim of his followers under an oak tree. Remember, the teraphim was the idol that was setting up usually in the groves to Baal or whatever. It would be the idol that they would set up there. Actually, not only did he bury the teraphim, which was the idol, but also all of their amulets. They had they would have these charms that they used. So he took all of those and buried all of them under this oak tree. That plays a part a little bit later, by the way. Uh, under which was this was afterward called the Oak of the Sorcerer, Genesis 33:19, 35:4, and Judges 9:37. Here too, after a while, he dug a well, which bears his name to this day, and we find that in John chapter 4, verse 5, and John 4:39 to 42 talks about this well that Jacob dug. To Shechem, Joshua gathered all Israel before God and delivered to them his second parting address in Joshua 24, 1 to 15. He made a covenant with the people that day at the very place where, on first entering the land, they had responded to the law from Ebal and Girasham in Joshua 24:25. The terms of which were recorded in the book of the law of God, which is the roll of the law of Moses. And in memory of this solemn transaction, a great stone was set up under an oak. All right. Before I go any further, just kind of look at your picture. You can imagine when they crossed the Jordan River and they came into the Promised Land, that Joshua gathered all the people in the valley between these two great mountains. And in fact, they were up on the sides. But what this forms is a natural, not an amphitheater, kind of it is, but you can get up on one of the mountains and holler and you can hear all the way through the valley because of the structure, the way that it's made. So they took all the children of Israel. Now there was a lot of people there. You know, when they crossed the Jordan River, you're talking 1 million or better people. And put them between these two mountains, and Joshua was able to communicate and read the law and give his message to them. And again, you know, that mountain at the bottom is only about 500 yards wide. So that's what, less than a mile, probably a little more than a quarter mile, between a quarter and 3/4 of a mile, I guess. So that's not very wide. Not very wide at all. So that was kind of the history of that particular region. And they set that pillar up under an oak as a silent witness of the transaction to all coming time. Now Shechem became one of the cities of refuge, the central city of refuge for western Palestine in Joshua 20:7. And here the bones of Joseph were buried in Joshua 24:32. Rehoboam was appointed king in Shechem in 1 Kings 12:1, 1 Kings 12:19, but Jeroboam afterwards took on his residence there. So Rehoboam was made king, but he was overcome by Jeroboam, if you read the stories. And this was... And the city is mentioned in connection with our Lord's conversion with the woman of Samaria in John 4 and 5, and thus remaining, as it does to the present day, it is one of the oldest cities of the world. So that's Shechem, a little bit about that particular city. So we have here Abimelech. Now Abimelech went to his mother's house in Shechem, and first of all he got her support and his brothers or other family members, the men in the family, to support him to be king. Now you'll remember last week that last lesson they wanted to make Gideon or Jerubbaal king. Israel said, "Come be our king," and he said, "I will not be a king. My sons will not be your kings, and my grandsons will not be your king." So he made a statement, and in those days that meant nobody's going to be your king out of my family. It wasn't just, that was a statement. That was the law at that point. When he said that, in the family, that became family law. Nobody would accept kingship. And so this was an opportunity for Abimelech. So Abimelech used the ploy that, would you rather have 70 sons of Jerubbaal making and ruling the nation of Israel? Because they weren't kings, they didn't want to be kings, but yet they were still, they were still considered to be the rulers. I mean, people would come to them for decisions, judging, that kind of thing. Gideon was dead, Jerubbaal, he died, and so now you got these 70 sons, and so Abimelech took the opportunity to say, look, they got 70 of them. Do you want those 70 telling you what to do? You want those 70 guys over there from the tribe of Manasseh ruling over you, or would you rather have one? Well, when they looked around, all the other nations had one. They had a king. Instead of a bunch of 70 brothers doing it, well, we'll just have a king. See, what he left out is the 70 brothers were relying upon God to give and rule, and the other kingdoms weren't. And so he was saying, hey, if you're going to be like everybody else, you need one king. Guess what? I'm up for the job. And by the way, I am one of your brethren. Yeah. So he used that ploy and convinced his brothers, who went and convinced the men in the town. And also there was that implied, thing. They're going to be oppressive to you, these 70. They're going to oppress you. But I'm your brother, and so I won't. I'll be on your side. Well, we'll see how long that lasts. So, the men of Shechem gave Abimelech 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Bel-Berith. Now, this wasn't 70 shekels, which was a coin. These were a different weight, and I couldn't find exactly how much that was, but these were larger weights, so it was a lot of money they took out of the temple of Bel-Berith. It's interesting that the Israelites, even though they were idolatrous, were worshiping, they still gave tithes and offerings just like they always did. They kind of mixed the law with everything else. So there was this constant flood of income coming in. And so this temple was probably quite rich. It was probably a lot of money. So they gave Abimelech 70 pieces of silver, and with that he was able to hire thugs and outlaws to go and kill his 70 brothers. The men he hired, now you might think if he wanted to start an army, he'd go hire soldiers, he'd go hire experienced, He found guys in the actual, if you read the actual phrasing in here, these guys were worthless. That would be like going down Pacific Avenue and picking up all these homeless guys standing around with nothing to do, and they're just drawing, oh yeah, we'll get those guys. Who better to follow you? Come on, I'll give you some money. Didn't have to pay them very much, and they're willing to go to the end of the earth for you. So his idea was pretty good. It worked out pretty well for him. However, he ended up with a bunch of thugs, and he ended up with a bunch of people that, following him, that they themselves couldn't even hardly follow orders, let alone show any kind of sympathy or empathy for anybody. They were just thugs. And he went to his brother's house in Ophrah, and there he slew 69 of his brothers. Now it says 70, that's a round figure, but one of them escaped. But he took the 69 that didn't escape and he killed them on a stone. It doesn't tell us very much more about that. However, if you remember, Gideon, the first act that Gideon did after God called him was to go up in Ophrah to where his father had built the altar and tear down the altar of Baal. Now Shechem were Baal worshippers. So it makes sense that in Shechem would give him 70 pieces of silver, not just to give it to him to be king, but so that he could buy a sacrifice to Baal. Okay. Who was a sacrifice to Baal? the 70 sons of Gideon. Excuse me. Man, this weather's great. Oh my goodness, thank you. So anyway, what he evidently did was take these 69 sons of Gideon and offer them as sacrifices to Baal on the single altar or stone. Probably the part of that altar that was torn down in Ophrah, part of that, maybe the top altar stone, used that to kill all 69 of them. He would have killed 70, but the youngest son hid and was able to escape. So, this was how this guy operated. Now the men, or the leaders of Shechem, and the house of Milo took Abimelech and made him king of Israel under the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. What do you think the pillar was? We remember another thing I read to you here, that Joshua set up a pillar under a tree as a remembrance. Where else, if you wanted to kick dirt in the face of God, where else would you go? Yeah, you tore down let me show you what Baal is really like. You took down his altars. Let me show you what Baal can do. And so he was anointed king in the same place that Joshua had set up that pillar to remember the commandments of God. Kicking dirt basically in the face of God. And he thought he could get away with that. Never a good idea. Now the house of Milo is interesting. There's a lot of different things out there about who or what is the house of Milo. But it appears that, from the wording here, that Milo was a fortification that was either in Shechem or right beside Shechem. And this probably referred to this temple of Ber-Berith. It wasn't just a temple like a lot of them. It was a fortified structure. It had walls that were 16 feet wide, that had rocks on the outside, and then it had tamped dirt in the middle. This is the same construction, by the way, that the Chinese used to build the Great Wall of China. If you've ever looked at that, how they did it, they built 2 stone walls on each side and then filled it with dirt. And then they just came along, these guys with these big heavy weights, and as they put a layer down, they pound it, and they put another layer down and pound it. Well, when you've got all these Chinese laborers, that wasn't a big deal. They just pounded away 24 hours a day until they packed that so solid you couldn't even put a drill through it. I mean, it's just like concrete. And that's the way they built these walls around this temple. If you look at your pictures,
Just right here.
Actually, that's one of them. You can see this is actually from the town of Shechem. This was a tower, but this is where the town of Shechem was when this Gideon's, how big it was actually. Probably it wasn't quite as large as it is here because it was rebuilt. But that square thing in the middle is the temple that we're talking about. And you can still see some of the walls there that they've uncovered. That's how they know how it was built. On the last page, that top paragraph is also a little closer look at that particular area. With the pillars, you can see it there. That was the temple of Ber-Harith. It had a tower in it. And it would probably have been in that upper left-hand corner if you're looking at the overhead shot, or just to the left of those pillars between there and the gate. So it was a fortified place. And this, thank you, is what everybody pretty much agrees is the house of Milo. Now it apparently had its own army or soldiers. to protect it. It was also considered to be the last bastion, if you will. So if Shechem fell, everybody was to go into there, and there they would be safe because this was a fortified place. And they could go up in the tower, and they would be safe from their enemies. The terebinth tree is the same one as I mentioned in Joshua 24:20c, 26. It's interesting that Abimelech was made king of Israel. We only see one city that actually did the anointing. We'll find also that there was another city or two that joined him, but basically it was just that little area right there that made him king of Israel. That would be like, we take our governor and decide to make him king of the world. I mean, that's that kind of a thing, He wants to be king of the United States, but that's another story. But, declaring that he's going to be king because we said so. We do find that Israel followed him, at least a good portion of it. We'll find that later in the story. But the initial kingship just came from Shechem. So it kind of gives you a little feel for how much influence Shechem had over the tribes of Israel. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that, I think it's obvious, but when we allow other influences to take control of us at times, as Gideon did in having a child by a concubine, when he already had enough wives to produce 70 sons, when we allow that kind of a thing to happen, it never turns out good. It's always going to turn out bad. When we violate the laws of God, we're going to be in trouble. Now, this is the first time it happened. I mean, look at Abraham. Here's Abraham. He has a promise of a son through Sarah, and yet he goes out and has a child by a concubine. Same situation. Who is it? Ishmael. Okay, well, where do you think the Muslims came from in Islam? Ishmael. No, they're not all Arabs. A lot of them are from old Babylonian Assyrians, so on. But the main thrust of that came from the Arabs, or from the descendants of Ishmael. In fact, the Kaaba, which is the most holy place in all of Islam, is a little temple that they say Abraham and Ishmael built. They say that was built by them to worship Allah. And so that's why everybody goes to Mecca, because they built the mosque at Mecca around this Kaaba. And, one mistake by one man thousands of years ago, and look where we are today. Yep. Israel is constantly at war. Why? Because of Ishmael. So it's important that, we may think something is not that important, or it's not going to carry many consequences. It never works out, and consequences are usually far greater than the misstep that was taken. So we have to be very careful in what we do. All right, let's move on to verse 9. Now when they told Jotham, this was the young boy who escaped, when they told Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim. That's one of the two mountains there. It would be the one on your left, I believe. And lifted his voice and cried out. So here's the town down there, and all of a sudden here's this boy. I don't know how old he was. I'm sure he wasn't 5 or 6 years old. He was probably a teenager at least. And he gets up on this mountain and he starts talking at the town. I'm sitting here and I'm kind of, when I saw this, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, right, okay, here's the town, and here's this guy by himself, some young kid up there, and he starts talking to the town. And, it just, the scene to me is kind of humorous. But the subject matter was not. It said he went on top of Mount Gishon, and he lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them, "Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you." That's a very, very bold statement. Listen to me, so God will listen to you. Isn't that what we say all the time? The preacher behind the pulpit? Listen to me. Listen to what I'm telling you, and God will listen to you. In other words, listen to what I'm saying, heed what I'm saying, do what I'm trying to get you to do, and God will listen to you when you cry out to Him. Wait a minute, these are a bunch of idolaters. Why would they cry out to God? Because He knew they were going to find themselves in a position where they were going to have to ask for the mercy of God. Listen to me, so God will listen to you. Powerful. Then He gave them this parable. He said, the trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I cease giving my oil, with which they honor God and men, and go to sway over trees? And then he said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to sway over trees? Then the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, and go to sway over trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now this is the first parable that's in the Bible, actually. And it is considered to be one of the most magnificent parables that's ever been written. Way before Aesop's parables. This one is considered to be absolutely amazing. And you look at it, you kind of say, why? But when you look at it, there is such a wealth of information in this little parable. And I'll stop here and go on. The nearness of Mount Gerizim to the city made it very easy for Jonathan to stand on the mountain and address the people to the town. Now he addresses the men, or the leaders of the town. So he asks them to listen to him. Then Jotham curses the leaders of Shechem by way of a parable. The tree represents men. So these were men that were going out to try to find somebody to rule over them. The olive tree represented Gideon. Now in the East, the olive tree is considered to be the top tree. And the reason is because it produces oil. And this oil is used for so many things. Olive oil, and we use it today. I cook with olive oil. I like olive oil. But it was also used in the temple. Because you remember the menorah, or the lamps, all burned with oil in the holy place. It was also used during the sacrifices. They used oil. It was used to anoint the high priest and all the other priests. They were anointed with oil. When a king was made king, or a king to be, he was crowned, he was anointed with oil. This was all olive oil.
That's why we have a
So-
lot of olive oil in Jerusalem.
Yeah, we got some, yeah.
There's a lot of
So the oil was considered to be the top product of a tree. It was the number one thing. This represented Gideon. And Gideon refused to be king. Why? Because he had been anointed by God to do a specific task, that was deliver Israel from the Midianites and then to judge Israel. He was anointed to do that. His oil went out as an anointing from God. He said, should I stop being a judge? Should I stop what God has anointed me to do so I can sway or rule over men? God rules over men. I just judge. That's what God's called me to do. And so they went to the fig tree. The next tree in line is the fig tree, because it produces rich figs. And we saw figs there. There's figs on trees year-round depending on the nature of the tree, the species of figs. And that's one of the main, was at that time anyway, one of the main dishes were figs. They used that for everything. It was a very sweet fruit. Now the sons never, as far as we know, never said they're not going to be king because they were never asked. But Gideon said they're not going to be kings. Why? Because they are my offspring. They are the sweetness of what I have done through the anointing of God. They're to carry on the judgeship. They should have been the ones who were carrying on the ministry, if you will, of Gideon. And so they went to the next ones. And they said, well, okay, the fig tree won't do it. The olive oil won't do it, and the fig tree won't do it. Let's go to the wine. Let's go to the vine. And of course, the wine is the number one thing they drank over there was wine, and from the fruit of the vines. And this was the grandchildren of Gideon. They provided the wine. They provided the enjoyment, if you will. And it even says here that it was something that was enjoyed not only by man, but by God. It cheers both God and man. And the spiritual wine, or the spiritual fruit of these grandchildren, would have been a blessing and an enjoyment to God. That's what he was saying. He said, so you didn't want any of them, or they wouldn't do it, so you went to the bramble. Now the bramble that's talked about here was the bramble that had those big thorns. And we talked about them last week. They would lay the guys down on them and Gideon would. It was that kind of thing. It was those big, in fact they called them darts. The thorns were so large. And these bramble bushes were absolutely worthless. It was the most worthless plant that you could think of out there in the wilderness. And the thing about brambles, they don't have a lot, and so they're very sparse. If you've been around brambles, they're not the ones we're talking about here. I think if you're out in the desert regions and you see a tumbleweed, it was kind of like that. That's the closest thing I can think of visually to think about a bramble. They were very dry, extremely flammable bushes. And it's interesting here that in this parable, he says, and the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. Now, the thing about a bramble is you don't want to get close enough to get in the shade of a bramble, because you're going to come out with cuts and slices, these huge thorns. You don't get close to a bramble. And a bramble tends to move around like a tumbleweed. And so, you don't want to be caught by one of those things, because it'll rip you up pretty good and mess you up. It's like getting in a rose bush. You don't want to get into that either. But this is worse. So you wouldn't want to be close to it. What the parable was saying here is that this bramble is saying to them, if you'll come and if you'll make me king, you can come over and be in my shade or in my shadow or in my protection. I'll protect you. How can a bramble bush protect a tree? That doesn't work very well. But notice it goes on to say, but if you don't, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. In other words, let the bramble catch fire and burn down the trees. This was the parable. You see, it's very detailed, and there's more things. We could spend quite a bit more time. I don't want to go into it. But this was the parable that Jotham gave. Then he goes on to give the definition or the translation of this curse in verse 16. Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and, there's always that and, if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have not done to him as he deserves, and has done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. Now this is inside of parentheses. So he said, if you've done well towards Zerubbabel or Gideon, but what you really did is, and then tells them inside of parentheses. So if you've sincere about making Abimelech king, and you've treated Gideon's house and everything well, if you have acted in truth in sincerity with Jerubbaal and his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. Now this sounds, you might think, well, he's saying he's blessing this whole thing, No, there's an if in there. If you're sincere about making Abimelech king, and if you have treated the house of Gideon correctly, all right, great. Rejoice, have a good time. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Malo. And let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Malo and devour Abimelech. Huh? What in the world is all of that? This was a curse. Because Jotham knew, number one, that the men of Shechem were not really sincere about having Abimelech king. They did it, but kind of out of pressure from Abimelech's family and his reasoning, you want these 70 guys or you want me, But they didn't really like Abimelech. And we'll see how long this whole thing lasted. Verse 21, and Jotham ran away and fled, and he went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother. Now Beer was, as far as we can tell, was a town that was beyond the northern edge of what is now Jerusalem, or soon to become Jerusalem. So it was a little town out in the Judean hills that was kind of obscure. And he went there to hide. This is the last we hear of Jotham. We don't know what Jotham did. The assumption is that he probably took over the judgeship and judged Israel for some time, as far as being just bringing their stuff to him and him judging them. But he never led any kind of a revolt. He never did anything. All right. All right, Judges 9:22-25. After Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years. You know, some of these guys rule for 20 years and what. He managed to make it 3 years. Notice verse 23. God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. And the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Now there are people that say God is a God of love and he never brings any kind of problems on anybody. What does this say? I even read one commentary that said, well, God allowed the devil to send. This says God sent a spirit of ill will. God sent the spirit, not the devil. When God wants to bring judgment, or God wants to bring condemnation, he doesn't have to rely on the devil. Quite often he does. Quite often he does. And in fact, on the recompense, we might be able to say, in the judgment of Shechem and Abimelech, yeah, that was probably, you could look at that and say, well, that was a devil. But actually, it was the spirit that God sent. That was the spirit of ill will. He went in there and caused havoc between Shechem and Abimelech. And I can remind you that it was the angels of God who brought fire and destruction upon Sodom and Gomorrah. It wasn't an angel of the devil. It was an angel of God. So he does, in fact, interfere with mankind in a negative way. Not everything God does is positive, from our way of looking at things. You hear people say, well, God is a God of love. You got to remember, just remind them about Sodom and Gomorrah. Remind them about this here. This is a good example. God will send judgment, and it will be his judgment. A holy judgment, not an unholy judgment. All right. So for 3 years, Abimelech reigned, everything went fine. And then here come this spirit, and he brought ill will. And Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Verse 24. This explains why God sent the spirit. That the crime done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might be settled, and their blood be laid on Abimelech their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem who aided him in the killing of his brothers. And the men of Shechem sent men in ambush against him, against Abimelech, on the tops of mountains, and they robbed all who passed by them along that way, and it was told Abimelech. So we have this spirit, and now all of a sudden this dislike that was probably already there for Abimelech from the men of Shechem began to fester. And finally they decided, you know what we'll do? We'll show Abimelech. Let's take all of our soldiers, or a bunch of them, and we'll put them on the mountaintops around here. And whenever, next time Abimelech comes along and passes over one of these mountain passes, of course you can see from that picture, these mountain passes amounted to a couple of 100 feet in the air. I mean, these were not huge mountains. But they were also very desolate places and very dangerous places because there were so many places where thieves could hide. And so these guys were up there waiting for Abimelech. And because they were the nature of these men, they saw an opportunity. Nowhere does it say they set them up there to rob everybody. They were up there to wait for Abimelech. But in the process, they decided, hey, you know, while we're here, these rich guys are passing by here, oh, let's rob them. Let's make a little extra cash for ourselves. And so these guys, who were probably about on the same level as the ones who went with Abimelech, they were up there to capture Abimelech, and they began to rob everybody. Well, the word then got to Abimelech. See, if they had just done what they were supposed to do, they might have managed to capture Abimelech. But because of their going beyond the limits of what they were supposed to be doing, then Abimelech got the word that they were out after him. So now Abimelech's, he's alerted, and the Bible tells us nothing about it, but you can assume that Abimelech got his army together, his trained soldiers, and he was ready for any problem that came out of Shechem. All right, let's move on to verses 26 to 29. Now we get introduced to a couple of new characters here. Now Gaul, the son of Ebed, came with his brothers and went over to Shechem, and the men of Shechem put their confidence in him. So they went out into the fields and gathered grapes from the vineyards and trod them and made merry, and they went into the house of their God and ate and drank and cursed Abimelech. So here we have this guy named Gaul, and we don't know anything about him, really. There's some conjecture that we can make about who he was. However, he must have been a man of substantial wealth and influence in the area. Now, some think that it was a Canaanite ruler. Others that he was a supporter of Abimelech who changed sides. But from verse 28, you get the impression that he may have been from the family of Hamor, who was founder of the city of Shechem and was killed, okay, well, he wasn't killed, but all the men in the city of Shechem were killed by Simeon and Levi because they defiled Dinah, their sister. And you can read that account, in the account of Jacob. But what was interesting is they spared all of the children. So could this have been one of the children that was spared? It starts to make sense because God said wipe them out. Life when they're supposed to wipe the whole town out. They saved the children. And so now here comes this guy named Gaul. Quite possibly one of the descendants of Hamor who may have been in that area, or may have been a child at that time who was spared. We don't know. But we do know that he and his brothers came to Shechem, and the leaders of the town listened to Gaul, who convinced them to openly rebel against Abimelech. So they went into the temple of Baal Berith, and they had a feast while worshiping Baal. So we know that he was a Baal worshiper. We know he was not a true, a follower of Jehovah. But he convinced them to have this feast. And so they went out into the fields, or into the vineyards, and they cut the grapes, and they brought them in, and they stomped them all down, and they had this big feast. And here they are in this temple fortified. They're having their debauchery and all of their festivities and all of this, and they're putting the drinks down, and then, and in the midst of all this, then Gaul the son of Ebed said, "Who is Abimelech? And who is Shechem, that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal? And is not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. but why should we serve him? So the question here is, who is Abimelech? And who is of the house of Shechem? Okay, that's what he meant by who is Shechem. Who is really of the house of Shechem? Abimelech isn't of the house of Shechem, he's of the house of Jerubbaal. So you see, he's turned it on Abimelech. Abimelech said, you know, the 70 sons of Gideon, that's of the house of Jerubbaal. That's the house of Jerubbaal. I am of the house of Shechem. Gaul says, who's Abimelech? He's not of the house of Shechem, he's of the house of Jerubbaal. That's his father. See, they always counted by the father. Abimelech turned it by counting by his mother, which was not the normal way to do it. He would have been considered the house of Jerubbaal. Interesting. Where am I here? Oh, I'm sorry. Then he introduces this idea of who is Zebul. Well, he isn't Zebul. This is in verse 28. And it is not Zebul, his officer. So what Gaul is saying is Abimelech said he was going to be your king. He is your, he is one of your brethren. Because his mother was from Shechem, so he's from Shechem, and he's going to be your king, and he's going to take care of you. However, where is he? He's not here. He put an officer by the name of Zebul to actually rule over you. Abimelech's not even here. He's over there somewhere, probably in Orpha. You see? So this Zebul, we find out, was the officer that Abimelech had put in charge of Shechem. So he goes on to say, serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem, but why should we serve him? Verse 29, if only this people, Shechem, were under my authority, then I would remove Abimelech. So he said to Abimelech, this is in the middle of this feast, he's not talking to Abimelech, Abimelech's not there, but he says to Abimelech, and he says, all right, Abimelech, hey, increase your army and come on out and let's fight. Put your words where your mouth is, in other words. You want to get rid of Abimelech, put me in charge. We'll find out in a hurry how quick we can get rid of Abimelech. That was Gaul. And how often do we hear that? Put me in charge and you'll see what happens. Yeah, what usually happens, just like what happened here. It didn't work out well at all. We have to know who we are putting in charge. We have to know who we're going to serve. And if it's not a godly man, then we don't want to serve him. That kind of sums it all up here. But you remember, this whole thing is being worked out as judgment against Abimelech and the people of Shechem. All right. All right, verse 30. When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaul, the son of Ebed, anger was aroused. Now, he was probably at that feast. So he's sitting there while this guy is saying, who is this Zebul anyway? He's over us. So he derided this guy who's over the city. And so anyway, Zebul got a little bit upset. And he sent messengers to Abimelech in secret, or secretly, saying, take note, Gaul the son of Ebed and his brothers have come to Shechem, and they are, and here they are, fortifying the city against you. In other words, they're getting the troops ready, they're getting everything to get ready to go to battle. Now therefore, get up by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall be as soon as the sun is up in the morning that you shall rise early and rush upon the city, and when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you may then do to them as you find opportunity. So this Zebul guy, he gets really mad, and so he sends a word to Abimelech, and he alerts him to what's going on, but he also gives him the battle plan. He says, you bring the people, the army you have with you, and you sneak in at night. And you lay in the fields. Now the fields, if you look at that picture, the fields were on the tops of the mountains and in the valley directly in front. If you've ever been down the Rhine River, it's really interesting because you look up on the hills as you're going down the Rhine River, and there are grape vineyards, and they're terraced into the side of the hills, and they're on the tops of these hills, and that's where they grow all the grapes for all of this French wine and and all that stuff that's supposed to be such great. It's terraced. It's all around you on these mountains. Now I don't know about terracing here, but that's where they had their vineyards, was on the sides and on the tops of these mountains. So Zebul's plan was for them to bring the army and hide in the vineyards, they call them fields, but they were really vineyards. Hide. As soon as the sun came up in the morning, before everybody's completely awake, charge into the city, and you can just do what you want. As the army comes charging out, you should be able to defeat them. Great plan. So, what happens? Well, let's go on to verse 34. So Abimelech and all the people who were with him rose by night and lay wait against Shechem in 4 companies. I think I say later 3, but 4 companies. When Gaal the son of Ebed went out and stood in the entrance of the city gate, Abimelech and the people who were with him rose up from lying in wait, and saw Gaal the people. He said to, and when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. But Zebul said to him, you see the shadows of the mountains as if they were men. Now, let's set the stage again for you. If you look at your picture, you got those 2 mountains. Now, the army is divided into 4 different areas, 4 different divisions, if you will. So you can kind of see probably one division's up on one mountain, another division's up on the other. One of them is in the front of the city, and they probably had another one stationed behind it, coming from the other direction. So all 4 areas were covered. Now when the sun just started to come up, the army started moving toward the city. Now, because of the way the mountains are laid out, when the sun came up, one mountain would be in sunshine, but the other one would not. So probably what Gaal saw was the one mountain, which I think was Ebed, I'm not sure, would be in the sun. And he saw men moving up there. But he didn't see any on the other mountain. So I can see Zebul saying, oh, you're just seeing the shadows as the sun is coming up. See over here, there's none over here. You're not seeing, just on that one mountain where the sun's coming, you're just seeing things. And I know I used to hunt and hike into some place where we're going to hunt early at night, or early in the morning. And we'd be there when the sun came up. And when that sun comes up, everything's moving. The sun coming through the trees, the wind's blowing a little bit, and all of a sudden you see movements all over as the trees are blowing a little and the sun starts to come through, and you see shadows and you think you see all kinds of things. Well, this was kind of what Zebul is trying to convince Gaal that he's seeing. You see the shadows. You're not really seeing anything. Verse 37. So Gaal spoke again and said, see, people are moving down from the center of the land, and another company is coming from the diviner's terebinth tree. So all of a sudden he sees coming down from the mountains, he can make out these soldiers, and in front of him he sees from the road that comes from the terebinth tree. where the pillar was set up by Joshua. Here comes the main force of the army of Abimelech. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. And then Zubal said to him, where indeed is your mouth now? With which you said, who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Are not these the people who you despised? Go out, if you will, and fight with them now. See, Zubal was taunting Gaul now. You opened your big mouth. You said you could do all of this. Okay, here it is. Put your actions where your mouth is. Get the army and go out there and fight. Now, I don't know how interested Gaul was in fighting at this point. When he saw all of these soldiers coming from 4 different directions, what's he going to do? Whoa. So anyway, the battle is set. Verse 39. So Gaul went out, leading the men of Shechem, and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled from him, and many fell wounded to the very entrance of the gate. Abimelech dwelt in Aramah, and Zebul drove out Gaul and his brothers, so that they would not dwell in Shechem. So the battle commences. And, of course, Gaul is only half ready. He didn't anticipate that Zerubbabel would be there. He thought he had time. He was fortifying the city. He was maybe training some troops, and he was getting everybody ready when he's standing in the gate looking out over the valley, and suddenly there's the enemy, right there. Time to go to battle. You don't have time to think. You sound the horns, you blow the trumpets, you get everybody out, and out the gate you go to battle. And of course, the outcome was obvious. Abimelech defeated them, chased them back into the city, and they went in and shut the gates. So here they are in their fortified city. There's a little statement here that's interesting, and that is that Abimelech didn't stick around. Abimelech went off. It was about 6 miles from Shechem, a place called Aramah, and there he spent the night. Now there's a lot of speculation as to why Abimelech went to Aramah to spend the night. Maybe he didn't like sleeping in a tent. I don't know. But he went about 6 miles to this town, and he spent the night there. A portion of it. While his army camped outside the gates of Shechem. In the meantime, we find our friend there, Zebul. He takes Gaul and all of his brothers and throws them out. Throws them outside the city. And chases them off. Now, I don't know what happened to Gaul and his brothers once they were outside the city. We don't know. I have to make the assumption that since the army was waiting out there, I don't think they probably lasted very long. You know, they were probably cut to pieces as soon as they got outside of the city. We don't know. All right. Verse, hold on just a minute. Let me read
42.
Yeah. I didn't read, I don't think, all of the scripture here. Verse 31. Oh, I see. I'm missing a page. That's what's wrong. picked up 2 pages. Wasn't making sense up there. Yes, sir. All right. All right, so Abimelech has defeated him, and he's gone for the night. So he comes back at night, and he sets his troops up very much the same as he did the first night. So Gaul went out. Oops, no, I'm still not. Yes. Went out. Okay. Verse 42, that's where I'm at. I'm sorry. Verse 42. And it came about on the next day that the people went out into the field, and they told Abimelech. So these people came out of the town, and whether they talked to Abimelech or to a messenger, we don't know. But they told him what had happened. That Gaul had been thrown out, that the brothers were gone, they were no longer there, and probably were trying to appease Abimelech by telling him, our problems are gone because it was Gaul and his brothers that were causing all the difficulty, and we've thrown them out. They're gone. So Abimelech reacted to that. It says in verse 43, so he took his people, divided them into 3 companies this time, and lay wait in the field. And he looked, and there were the people coming out of the city. So he went up, hid in the field again, and he waited, and out came the laborers. They were going out into the vineyards to work. Okay. And he rose up against them and attacked them. Then Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate to the city, and the other 2 companies rushed upon all who were in the fields and killed them. He's a nice guy, he really is. So in answer to their, that they got rid of their problem, he has 2 companies that attack him and kill him, and while they're doing that, they run to the gate, him and his company, and they stand in the gate. Nobody could get back into town. Nobody could get out of town, and so he isolated Shechem. So Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He took the city and killed the people who were in it, and he demolished the city and sowed it with salt. So he devised a plan to take and divide the city. The workers all came out, they were killed in the fields. He guarded the gate with the men with him, and when the fighting in the field was over, the whole army went into town, and it was a street-by-street battle against the army or the soldiers who were in the city of Shechem. But he overtook the city. There was a tower there that they used, very much like we talked last week about the tower. He destroyed that tower. He demolished the city, and he sowed it with salt. Now this sowing of salt is kind of interesting because that was a tradition, or what we did when you overtook an enemy, or you came into a territory of your enemy. When you destroyed them, you would take salt and put it in the fields, and that ruined the fields so they couldn't grow crops, and it would take a long time to get that salt out of there. I know in Central California they have a natural salt base that comes up out there, and if you leave the soil alone for a couple of years, you go out there and this stuff is just coming up almost out of the ground. It's a, I can't think of what they call it, but you have to go get lime, and you put this lime down, and that eats up this salt and makes the ground fertile again. And of course it's very fertile once you get that ground taken care of. Very, very fertile. And so that's the way it was here. But in this case, he didn't sow salt in the fields. He wasn't after the territory. He wasn't angry at the territory, it was the city. And salt, in this case, was merely a symbol. And that symbol was saying that it's barren, this city will be barren, because salt was a sign of barrenness, and it showed his utter hatred for the city and the people. Interesting, his mother was from there, but he hated the people. Now you remember, he got into power by convincing them he was for them, but in actuality he hated them. So he destroyed all of them. It doesn't say anything about his own house. The kind of man he was, he probably killed his brother and his mother and everybody else, because that's the kind of man he was. Killed his brothers without even thinking about it. And then he put salt in the city, sign of barrenness. All right. Now let's move on. Judges 9:46. Now when all the men of the tower of Shechem had heard that the city had been destroyed, they entered the stronghold of the temple of the god Berith. And it was told Abimelech that all the men of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. Then Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bough from the trees and took it and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the people who were with him, "What you have seen me do, make haste and do as I have done." So each of the people likewise cut down his own bough and followed Abimelech. So what Abimelech did here is he has destroyed the city, and now here's this temple, this fortress. And in this fortress was the tower, but it was, as I said, large walls that were all fortified. He was not going to break in there. So what he did is he went up to this Mount Zalmon. Zalmon means shady place. It was probably on one of the two mountains that were there. It was a place where they had a lot of shade, which meant a lot of trees. And so he cut a bough off of a tree, and he had everybody do the same thing. So now they're all walking around with these big boughs on their shoulder. And they followed Abimelech. Verse 49, so each of the people likewise cut down his own bough and followed Abimelech, put them against the stronghold, and set the stronghold on fire above them, so that the people of the tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. So what he did was he put these against the city, the gates of the stronghold, and against the tower doors, and caught them on fire. Now, you know, we've been there, you know how arid it is, very dry. So you can imagine, if you get a good fire going, it's not going to take long to catch everything on fire. And if you have 100 guys that are each bringing a big bough, and you get them on fire, and you put these boughs, stack them up, it had to be a big pile of firewood. And when you fire that off, what's going to happen? Anything wood that's within the area is going to catch fire. And what he did, he burned, of course, the roofs and everything were all wooden. All of that caught fire. And when the gates burned down, I'm sure they rushed in. But everybody was up in that tower, and they just burned the tower. The stairs, everything. And you can imagine what a mess that would have been. 1,000 people in the tower, and they were all killed. What was the curse? How were the men of Shechem going to die? By fire. All right. Now this Tower of Baal not only had the soldiers, it had the priests of Baal, it had the prostitutes, probably, that were there in the temple. That was part of their worship. They were up in the tower. So And you had women and children who had fled from the town. They were all up in the tower. So these 1,000 people up there were primarily idolatrous priests, prostitutes, and then some people that escaped the city. All right. Verses 50 to 55, and we're almost done. Then Abimelech went to Thebes, and he encamped against Thebes and took it. Now Thebes was a town that was close to Shechem, and they had no doubt joined Shechem in their rebellion against Abimelech. That's why he went there. It was very close. I don't think you'll see it on any of the maps. You'd have to probably look it up to find out exactly where it was. But it was very, very close to Shechem. Verse 51, but there was a strong tower in the city, and all the men and women, all the people of the city, fled there and shut themselves in. Then they went up to the top of the tower. Now these towers, you know, we think about towers, medieval towers, you know, with the cutouts on the top. But these were very large towers. I think about Megiddo when we were, was it Megiddo we were at? Yeah, we went to Trailer Park. You know, that was a big flat area. You had the walls that stood up around them, so you could, you know, you could look over the walls, you could throw stuff down at people. It was a large flat area on top. And they usually had provisions, they had water, they had stuff stored so they could last quite a while up there. If somebody were to lay siege to the town, they could go up there and they had a chance then to shoot arrows down at them or whatever to defeat the enemy. And that was the kind of thing it was. Of course, not as large as Megiddo. Megiddo was huge compared to this, but still it was a large area up on top. So you can see Abimelech comes into town. He took Thebes. He took the city. And here's this strong tower, and all the people of the city are up there on top of this tower. Verse 52, so Abimelech came as far as the tower and fought against it, and drew near the door of the tower to burn it with fire. So he decided that he'd do the same thing here with this tower that he'd done with Shechem, over there with, you know, the temple. So he probably went out and got the guys together. Come on, get your bows, let's go out. You know, we're going to burn another door we got to burn down. But notice he had to fight his way to the tower. That tells me that the people on top of the tower weren't giving up. You know, they probably had archers up there, you know, they're shooting arrows down, they're throwing stuff off of the top. They used to have boiling oil and boiling water, and they'd pour that down as they got close. This was some of the tactics that they used in those days. You know, they were up on those battlements, and you're going to shoot an arrow up to the top of the and do any damage. You know, that's not going to happen. So these guys were doing all of this, and here come Abimelech. Well, his hatred for those people was so great that he ran the risk himself. He ran up to the door, and he's going to burn this door down. All right, so that's where we are. Verse 53, notice this. But, you know, every time you think you're going to defeat God or you're going to defeat something, there's always that but that comes in. But a certain woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. You know, here's this king, he's so enraged, he's just wiped out a whole city, killed thousands of people, and now he comes to this town, he wipes out the town, and he goes to the tower, and he's going to take this tower too, and he's going to burn it down, and all of a sudden here's this little lady with an upper millstone. Now, you know, millstones came in all different sizes for all different reasons. I know we were in Holland, and in one of the windmills they had there, you know, we were watching them grind, and they had these huge millstones like this, you know. Well, obviously it wasn't a big millstone like that. No woman's going to pick that up and put it over the battlement and drop it on somebody. But they had small ones that they would use in their own houses and things, and they were probably, you know, I would say probably about like that, the upper stone. And that would be on the, they have one stone and it's got grooves in it. You put the grain in it, you drop this on it, and you turn it. And this is what she had. So I can see her going over to the edge and she sees that king down there coming over to burn her door down. You know, there's nothing like a woman who you're going to try to break into her house or destroy her kids. You better watch out. But I see this woman, she's down there and says, look at that. I don't know how high this tower was. You know, I don't know. But that millstone came down on top of Abimelech and crushed his skull. "54. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, lest men say of me, a woman killed me. I mean, here's Abimelech. He's got a stone crushed his skull. He's about to die. And what is he worried about? His pride. Does he care what anybody says when he's dead? No. But he was so full of pride, so full of self-ambition, so full of wanting to make sure that he did something that everybody would remember, that even his last breath was to protect his pride. Isn't that like people today? You know, you try to explain what's going on, you tell them where they're going, you tell them what's going to happen, but what would people say? If I quit going to the bar every night, what would people say? What would they think about me? It's pride. Pride goeth before a fall. Good from Solomon. So the young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed, every man to his place. Interesting. Here, all of this fighting's going on. These people are up in the tower. Abimelech dies, and the army of Israel turns around and walks off. When you're fighting for a man, when the man goes, you leave. Think about the mighty men of David. They weren't fighting for David because David wasn't always there. And yet they stood and they fought. And they fought, and they kept fighting until the battle was won. When you're fighting for God, you fight until the battle is won. When you're fighting for a man, when the man falls, you fall, you leave. So it's imperative, I think, that we understand why we serve, and who we serve, and why we do what we do. All right. It is fitting that since Abimelech killed the 69 sons of Gideon on a stone, that he would die by a stone. You know, God does things that we don't always comprehend it, we don't always understand it, you know, but when you look at the details, you see how detailed God is. You want to kill him with a single stone? Fine, you kill 69 my people with a stone, I'm going to kill you with the same thing. All right, verse 55. Thus God, wait a minute, who? Thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers. And all the evil of the men of Shechem, God returned on their own heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. You know, not only was Shechem an evil place, not only did they, have this big temple to Baal, Berith, but they also desecrated the holy places that God had designated. Joshua put up a pillar, because God told him to put up a pillar, as a remembrance. And what did the men of Shechem do? They turned that into a place of idolatry. They turned it into a place where they would anoint ungodly king. They called it a place, the tree of enchantment, this oak tree. They called it the place where they could go and do their evil enchanting and whatever they did in their worship, and supposedly Baal would give them signs at a place God had set aside. And when God set something aside, it better be put aside and kept the way He wants it. All right, any questions? See, I did it inside of an hour and a half.
I was beginning.
All right, we'll continue next week.